Welcome, everybody. Hopefully, everyone's getting settled in to the Hop-In platform and Curbivore. I know for me, this is one of my first virtual conferences, definitely the first one I've helped co-organize, but I think things are going pretty smoothly. So if you're watching right now, you're on the main stage, and this is typically where we're going to be having our one-on-ones, our keynote conversations, and then we also have programming going on in the Sessions tab, or a couple things too that you'll be able to check out later in Expo. So appreciate everyone who's joining, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have right now with a mobility expert and hopefully someone I can call my good friend, John Rossant, who is the chairman over at New Cities Foundation and also CEO of CoMotion. They throw a bunch of great mobility events, and I know they have one coming up here in virtually. I was going to say Los Angeles, but virtually now, November 17th and 19th, and we'll leave links and information for that. But John, welcome. How are you doing?
Pretty good. In fact, I feel like using my computer to order in some breakfast, but
yeah, I think we might have to make it a requirement if you're watching this conference that you sort of have to use some sort of app-based delivery, or at least a Chow Now, I think, as we heard in our earlier keynotes, since they kind of highlighted how they work with all of their restaurants. So really appreciate you coming on, John. And I wanted to start off by just getting a sense of, like, when you hear the word curb, like what do you think of? Like, are there certain stakeholders that you think of? Are there certain personal mobility options? Do you think of yourself strolling down the street, or do you think of the technological aspects? Because I think it's a very personal term. So I'm curious to know kind of what you think about it, just more generally.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I mean, I think my perception of the curb, I think with everybody else's, has changed pretty dramatically in the last 6 months that we've been under this incredible pandemic. So I think, but even before COVID, because I think this is a conversation that goes beyond the pandemic. And I think what was clear, very, very clear, is that for the last couple of years, at least, more and more attention has been focusing on the curb as this kind of intersection, unique intersection of public and private in a city. It wasn't COVID. It was, at least a year ago that we began to, read horror stories, in fact, about the congestion in Manhattan streets because of deliveries.
Yeah.
And, there was beginning to be a real fight over curb space. More and more people were going online, and this is before COVID. So the conversation predates the pandemic in a real sense.
Yeah.
If you look at the sort of urban mobility revolution, and I think it is that, and we are in, at the beginning of a vast revolution in how goods and people move around cities. The curb is where a lot of this is sort of transacted, basically. It's where delivery vans have to go. It's where you stand and hail an Uber or a Lyft, et cetera. It's where you park your bird scooter, et cetera. So the way I look at it is that cities traditionally have been pretty kind of dumb, passive actors. Dumb without a voice in that sense. An Uber would come along, as it did sort of 8 or 9 years ago, and there was absolutely no regulatory framework to have an Uber. And sort of now there is in all cities. Bird a few years ago came about and just started putting in its scooters in Santa Monica and LA, and then everywhere else without regulatory frameworks. And I think what's been really notable over the last 2-3 years is how, or perhaps a little more, is how cities themselves, the public realm, is stepping up to the plate and becoming a much more active rather than passive actor. And I think where a lot of that conversation takes place is around the use of the curb, which is why this is so interesting.
Yeah. And I think that, kind of like you mentioned, with the public and private sort of use cases, but also, I guess, just interests, right? It's kind of one of those unique places. I guess the original, public versus private, kind of, I guess, contentious space was the roads, right? I guess one thing that I think about too, when you start thinking about the curb, is like, have we figured out the roads yet first? Do we need to figure out the roads first before we move on to the curb? Because it seems like we're identifying a lot of these big areas of challenges and opportunities, but we're not always necessarily the best at solving them. What do you think about that?
I think so. I don't think it's an either or thing between,
Hmm.
roads and curb. I think it's,
Can
it's
do
and
both at the
and.
same time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I mean, there's a whole other discussion about the roads, but what it does come down to is about the public right of way.
Hmm.
And, in roads, you have the public right of way. And so the public sector vis-a-vis, I mean, the public good, let's say, uh, has to make itself known and has to be at the table on a kind of equal footing with private operators, I feel.
Yeah.
So we've seen that on the road. We're now seeing that around the curb. So I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle about who really controls the curb. I think ultimately, it's a public right of way around the curb.
Hmm.
So,
So
so yeah,
with the pandemic, I mean, kind of like
yeah,
you mentioned, I think it really, one of the reasons why we wanted to put this conference on is because it has accelerated so many of the discussions that were happening at the curb prior to COVID and the pandemic, and now a lot of that has been accelerated. Have there been any major winners? And I guess we could also talk about losers too. But I mean, who do you see as the sort of winners and losers of the pandemic in a sense when it comes to the curb? What businesses are benefiting? I guess what comes to mind for me is the fact that there's less traffic on the roads, in a lot of places and a lot of times. I don't know exactly how that translates over the curb, but I'm curious what you think about the winners and losers of the, kind of curb when it comes to the pandemic.
well, look, I mean, I think, Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, who was then sort of ignominiously booted out of Uber, I would say, wasted no time in setting up his cloud kitchen operation. That predates
Right.
COVID, so he had a very good intuition there. And we see other actors entering that field. So I think the whole general area of cloud kitchens is something that will last.
Hmm.
That has certainly been, anybody in the cloud kitchen business is benefiting now
Yeah.
because we're all, restaurants are apart from sidewalk operations. People are just ordering in, and
Yeah.
delivery has just exploded. So it's an obvious thing.
Right. But I guess for the most
Um,
part, restaurants have kind of struggled. And I mean, obviously we're trying to highlight a lot of the ways that the restaurants that are doing well, or that have adapted to delivery during pandemic or different
yeah,
business models. So I guess even within, that sort of, general shift of people ordering more food to their houses, but that doesn't necessarily always benefit the restaurant. So there are some people in the
no,
ghost
but I mean,
kitchen, virtual
I've
kitchen.
been really impressed. Of course not, but I've been impressed by how some really savvy restaurant operators. I mean, I
Yeah.
think of here in Los Angeles, the people behind Bestia
Mhm.
and what's the name of the second restaurant in the Arts District. I mean, these were the hot
Yeah.
restaurants. Absolutely devastated because of COVID. The restaurants closed down, but they very, very, very quickly shifted to delivery and did
Hmm.
it in a very smart way. It was very intelligently marketed. And from what I understand, things are okay. They're weathering this out. They've established a pretty, vigorous side business. So I think
Yeah.
we are seeing, success stories
Yeah,
around.
and it's
I
funny
mean,
that
that
you
said,
mentioned
I mean,
Bestia
there's
because I,
no
I actually
question that,
ordered from them a few weeks ago and did a pickup meal, and because it was a restaurant that I've actually always wanted to try, but it was so difficult to get reservations,
right?
and now they have their meals available for pickup and to go, and it was just really cool to see how they actually put little instructions on each cardboard box, and it said, oh, heat me up for 8 to 12 minutes in the skillet, or you can microwave, and so I could sort of tell I'm someone who orders a lot of delivery across all the different platforms and services and options. And you could really tell that they had put a lot of thought into it and they were one of the better ones
Yeah.
adapting to the pandemic.
I mean, I think the real test is going to be, if we are really, unfortunately, in for a second wave of COVID now
Hmm.
that cold weather is coming in
Yeah.
large parts of certainly of this country, Northeast. How is that going to affect things? Because I think it's here in Southern California, we're blessed with a very warm climate all the time, and
Yeah.
so we can have viable sort of long term outdoor eating arrangements. You cannot have that in sort of Manhattan or Boston or Chicago. I mean, I think you could put heat lamps and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think restaurants, there's going to be a lot of pressure in the next few months for restaurants to really explore the delivery
Yeah.
option.
Do you,
And
do you think curb access has gotten better or worse for the general public? So, I mean, I guess I'm talking about, kind of like the everyday person, you, me, your neighbor, your friends. I mean, I guess I think of the fact that, there's now more open air dining, especially in the warmer air cities, but, there are more restrictions on the curb. So people who maybe are, going down the sidewalks in wheelchairs, I've seen stories that they're now having, more issues. So definitely some positives and negatives, but what do you think?
I agree. I mean, I think we haven't sorted it out.
Hmm.
I like to bike. I
Yeah.
bike out of LA, and I find in some areas, particularly in Santa Monica, it's tough now to
Hmm.
go down a street where everybody's in the street, on
Hmm.
eating their dinner, and it's very unclear sometimes where exactly I have to go. And there's something called the sidewalk, which is nice to walk on, and you
Yeah.
stare in shop windows, etc. You can't do a lot of that when it's full of diners.
Yeah.
So, this has to, it'll be give and take over the next
Hmm.
few years.
So do you think cities are the one that need to sort of assign and dole out, who gets how much space of the curb for outdoor dining versus walking and, ensuring equitable access? Obviously, I know that's a big component to cities or, we don't need
Well,
to figure it all
it's
out
not a
right now,
city.
but
It's not a city who, I mean, someone has to do it.
yeah.
And someone, I think, in the public realm has to do it, and that's the city.
So I guess my
So,
question is then how do they do it? Like I said, we don't need to figure it all out now, but what tips might you have for someone like that? Because I think, one thing that I love about your experience and what the CoMotion conference brings is it brings together those public and private partnerships, but it also does it on a global scale. And I think if anything that the pandemic has shown us is that the United States is not that great, has not handled the pandemic very well in a lot of different aspects. So I love learning from other cities or other examples or just other people who kind of know have really tried and experimented with unique things.
yeah, well, I mean, thanks for mentioning that, because I think cities and countries, must and can and must learn from each other. And
Hmm.
I think U.S. cities, also many U.S. cities have looked to Europe. I mean, the Europeans, I think, if you look at Paris, for example, I
Yeah.
mean, there's been outdoor dining forever in Paris,
Mhm.
and it's one of the features of Parisian life
Yeah.
that I think really works well. And nobody talks about, gee, it's a problem to have access or something.
Hmm.
It's worked. It's been worked out. So I think there are things we can learn from them. And in fact, we have a whole delegation from the Paris government at CoMotion LA next month to talk about some of these things.
Hmm. Very cool. Very cool. So I think with a few minutes left that we have, is there any, I guess sort of going forward when you look into the future of mobility and the future of the curb and kind of how it fits into this mobility, area that we're all interested and fascinated by and studying? What do you see as the biggest opportunity or something that sort of people need to just kind of keep in mind, to watch out for too, as far as, going forward in the future?
Look, I mean, I think we're only at the beginning of this sort of massive transformation of urban life that
Mm.
was already underway when COVID hit, and I think COVID has sort of sped things up in certain ways.
Yeah.
But you know, I think one thing is for sure is that the future of both transportation, of delivery, of logistics, of how you or I or a package gets from point A to point B in the city. What is sure is that the future is going to be incredibly more multimodal than it
Mhm.
has been. And so people will go around on streets in bicycles, electric bicycles, shared electric scooters, an electric scooter of your own, cars, electric cars, autonomous shuttles, in a couple of years in some kind of contraption that will actually lift you up into the sky and take you across the city at a low altitude way,
Yeah.
eVTOL. So, in the same way, streets will not only be for cars.
Mhm.
And I think one of the most interesting phenomena that we're seeing now is a movement to partially pedestrianized streets of major cities. So it's no longer the curb, it's the street itself. It's this thing that extends from a storefront all the way from one side of the
Yeah.
street all the way across the sidewalk, a curb, across the street, another curb. It's a whole universe of things.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to have just a great variety and diversity of vehicles, of ways we use this outdoor realm.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really excited. I mean, you mentioned the Parisian example of the outdoor dining, and it kind of reminds me of when I did my honeymoon in Italy, and, everywhere is basically outdoor dining. And it was quite, lovely. I have to say, eating your meals outside is just funny how it's so ingrained in the European culture in a lot of ways. And now here we are. And I think in the past, we would have thought, wow, that's be really difficult to completely change the culture and shift overnight, even though a lot of people, if you ask them, they probably would say that they prefer that. And now we have this opportunity to take advantage of that. So really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And if folks want to learn a little bit more about your work and find out information about CoMotion LA happening November 17th to 19, I think we'll put a link here in the chat box, but feel free to share info on where they can go, John.
Right. www.commotionla.com. Yeah. Come on, come on.
Cool. Well, we appreciate it, John. And I do want to mention we've got a lot of great programming today and tomorrow here on Hop In. Hopefully, as part of the Kerbivore conference, hopefully everyone is figuring out the virtual platform. I think it's pretty seamless so far. No
Not
major
bad.
issues
Yeah.
or
Bravo.
blackouts, knock on wood. And I do want to highlight that our next session coming up in a couple minutes, we like to leave at least a minute or two in between each session so you guys can and girls can go to the restroom or take a little quick break. But we're going to have a really interesting interview with Bloomberg City Labs West Coast Bureau Chief Laura Bliss, and she'll be interviewing Eater LA's senior editor Farley Elliott. So this is something we've got programming, kind of dedicated to the tech and the startup side. We've got programming dedicated to the food and the restaurant and retailer side, but we also have a number of panels that are really on this intersection of food and urbanism to sort of help each other and sort of see where the opportunities and challenges lie ahead. So really excited for that one and appreciate you coming on, John.
Thanks, Harry.